Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 147. If you haven't done so already, please follow LinkedIn, the IOH live stream on LinkedIn. That really helps us get the word out. I'm really honored to have our guest today, Darren Rolls, Identity of no rank, but somebody I've wanted to have on the live stream since day one. So welcome, Darren.
Thank you, Mike. Great to be here.
So it's your first time, so maybe a quick intro on your career trajectory.
Yeah, certainly. As you highlight, we've known each other for many years. It is strange that I've not been on, but glad to do so. You had a last minute opening here, so I'm glad to come on. But yeah, a little bit about myself. I mean, I've been in identity pretty much my entire career, over 30 years now. I started out very early. Working on distributed user in a Corba framework way back in the early 90s, and was acquired into Tivoli Systems IBM and became part of their user administration team, and then left there and with a number of the other team, and was part of Waveset Technologies, which I'm sure anybody who follows the space knew. Waveset was acquired by Sun, became the Sun Identity Manager, and worked very closely there with that, and then left with again another leaders of that effort to create SailPoint, and I was the CTO at SailPoint for 12 years, and through the final 4 years of that, I was also truly the operational CISO, and felt the pain and suffering that every CISO does, and retired from SailPoint in 2020. And figured I don't know, go climb some mountains like that one behind me and do some fun things, and pretty quickly found myself dragged back in doing some angel investing, doing a little bit of due diligence work, and some consulting for some of the investors. And that's the side I sit now, really, about do some advisory board work and work with a bunch of people that are bringing new solutions into this still very exciting market.
So you asked why I didn't have you on earlier, and in a way it's because I dream about retirement, and I'm like, Darren retired. He doesn't want to get dragged back into this stuff anymore. I saw your incredible camper van and everything, and I'm like, he's off doing that. So why drag him back into identity? But we're glad to have you back as a commentator.
It's such an exciting space, and I think anybody that's intellectually curious, a friend of mine, Colin Perry, always says I'm a double click. I'm Mr. Double. I love to double click down into detail on things. I'm interested in geology and neuroscience and all kinds of things, and identity is just such a deep, almost philosophical topic that's rooted in real material security. So I just been doing it for long enough. I just love it, and it feeds a part of the brain that just doesn't go away whatever you do. So I get to balance my time now, which is great, between the two.
My wife is very skeptical about my whether I will actually retire. So it remains to be seen.
My advice would be, don't use that word. What is retirement? What I did is change the focus of my life. I mean, I was very dedicated to the space and the company, and live, eat, sleep, breathe, and I just have more balance now. I get to do the things I love doing, both in identity and not. I love working with young, energetic businesses that are driving the value proposition. And so, yeah, as they say in the UK, I live the life of Riley. I really do have a very blessed life.
So we just ran into each other at Navigate, which the Austin version of Navigate, I guess, which is probably the biggest one I get, probably, right? And I'm curious, what would be the headline from Navigate 2025 for you?
Well, I very much felt a customer, a partner, and a vendor invigorated. I really felt an energy, which I think, we both commented while we were there. There was a certain sort of palpable energy, a reinvigoration of both innovation and direction. It's tough to be a market leader for 20 years, 15, let's be, okay, so call it 10. It's a tough place to be, particularly in an area that's gained so much external emphasis. And so, lots of the competitive landscape changed so much. And I think to some degree, SailPoint itself, questioned the ability to continue to lead and innovate. And I think what I saw was very much a forward thinking, innovative drive, back in not just the direction, but in the message and in the product. So I thought that was great. And wow, wasn't it busy, right? I mean, super busy event. So, and
Yeah,
even sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, I was very impressed with the event. And Austin's in a state of chaos right now with the convention center construction, and so there was some obstacles in logistics working around that. But I thought I was very impressed, with the, Fairmont and Marriott worked well together, and there's, people, there was a lot of people who came. And yeah, I thought it was a really impressive event. And I see SailPoint as like one of the greatest Austin business successes of all time. So I'm just really proud to have SailPoint as a part of our tech community and the identity community.
And I've often said that Austin is like little mini Identityville. It really is Identityville. And I think part of that is that history. Certainly, when Waveset was acquired by Sun, they pretty much gave us the identity business, and we moved some part of that to Austin at that time. But it seems to have remained an innovation focus. And I think having things like South by Southwest that in town there that really does that sort of forward thinking challenge thing. Having you there, having the vendors that we do, it really is a great town
Unbound
for
ID,
identity. Unbound, I mean, just fantastic, great
right?
location for it. And although I do spend probably about half of my time in the Pacific Northwest now, hence where I am right now, I still keep a place in Austin and love to be back there. So it's just a great town for it.
It's a paradise here. Okay, let's pivot into the topic at hand finally. So I have to say my favorite presentation at Navigate was a presentation with Ian, Laurie, and Matt, about the partnership between Signal and SailPoint. And so that talk had dynamic security orchestration in the title. But let me show a picture from this. And I sort of want to start in the middle with something that I thought was really interesting. So this is a picture, and pardon me fumbling with the screen sharing here. But
It is. There it is. I see it.
yeah. So take off the topic. Yeah. So this is showing basically how Signal receives an event. And I thought, this one part of it I found really interesting. After detecting a change in the graph, Signal will evaluate the change and determine what actions should be taken. And to me, this is a really, really interesting and different way to look at the world. To me, this says that they have a graph that describes the world as they know it, and that they're looking for changes in that. And then based on that change, they're going to trigger a certain workflow.
Right.
I'm just curious if you understand it like this, or had any thoughts on
Yeah, no,
this.
I think it is a very interesting way of looking from a sort of a data and event up view, which is I think where we get this view of orchestration. I think orchestration's meant many things to many different people. We've all had the sort of the authentication flow orchestration picture front of mind when we use that word. And I think what this tells us is that essentially based on environmental data-driven triggers, we should carry out action, and that gives a dynamic flavor to the rest of what is fundamentally a very static world. I mean, I think Ian in his talk mentioned this sort of view that there's 80 keys on a grand piano, and that only 5 and maybe 4 were available to us in identity: join, to move, or leave us, sign on, and potentially sign off. And And I think this model says, gee, I can't wait. It says, I see something in the data and let's take action. And I think that's very much the model for the future and delivered now. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, Ian said something to the effect of we need more vectors for action other than joiner, mover, lever, and login. And he also said, contextual information has been out of the reach of the IDP IGA infrastructure. And I see this slide as sort of showing a mechanism for how to organize that contextual data,
Right.
so we can react to it.
Yeah, and the thing I like about that is, I mean, with the caveat of centralization, and I do think as this whole thing evolves, we're going to go through centralization back to distribution. But to some degree, you have to do that. You can't, I mean, we all want to know the endpoint status. We all want to know some risk score about an identity or an individual, but we can't all aggregate it. We can't all be watching it. It just doesn't work like that. So I think in a modern, what one might say, overlay architecture that Signal would deliver today. And by the way, I don't work for Signal, right? So who am I to say what they do? That is a universal place to put it, in a layer just like that, where you do centralize the key contextual elements that you should know about, that can affect decisions and should change us from a more static view to a more dynamic one. So I think there's something, sort of a quasi-architectural about it.
Yeah.
Important.
Well, one thing I liked about this is that, of course, at Glue, we're designing our own. We call it hub system. It's also an event hub, let's say. We're using hub system as a homage to Murderbot, and the hub system is the system that collects all the data from the bots. And but in our system, we've been recently thinking about, in an authentication workflow, we have a parameter called ACR, and a client sends a request to auth server with that ACR, and that gives us a hint as to which workflow we need to put the user through. And domains can have many workflows for authentication. But what I liked about this approach is that it provides a mechanism for naming, like, what would be the equivalent of ACR to figure out what workflow we're triggering in in responding to this asynchronous event. And so graphs are good at naming, they're bad at attributes, but this is a naming problem. And so I really think that the graph model is I wouldn't want necessarily my orchestration workflow code in the graph, but I like the idea that my graph is like the way that I sort of model the world and name the things that happen.
Yeah, sort of ontologically. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, it's very much in its infancy, the SSF, and hence with it CAPE, which is fundamentally what they were talking about at the conference, right? Was CAPE message token types that are, they are the security events, and I think there's an immense amount of work to be done there, in terms of describing those things. But yeah, I mean, graph seems to be the way we're going, right? That flexible nature, and I think a graph of graphs is really what a picture. I don't think Signal talks about it like that, but SailPoint has a graph. That was one of the things that they announced at the event. It was very exciting. Was, hey, they now have a dynamic graph that you can put some things in, but it really is a graph of graphs that this will come from.
I think graphs is a part of the solution, but an important part, and it gives me some satisfaction to say that LDAPs are graphs after all, right?
Yeah.
They're hierarchical naming structures. So I think that I think there is really a part for different data structures and ways to handle this. But so let me go to the next slide. So, okay, let's assume that, some event has happened, that this has been detected by an event hub like Signal, and now the event hub decides it's going to invoke a workflow in SailPoint. And let me attempt to show image number 2, which would be this one. So So this is basically saying, okay, sail signal detected something that should be happen. It makes an API call to SailPoint, which then invokes a workflow, maybe to provision, add the user to a group or something. Um, and I guess what I wanted to point out here is that what I was wondering is how many of the events that an event hub might detect would result in an identity management flow or an identity governance. I don't know what you call this. It looks like an IDM flow to me.
Yeah, a provisioning flow, right? It's a
Yeah.
desired state
Um,
provisioning flow.
And but it seems like this is only a subset of all the security
Right.
things that I might detect in my world. How many of them could be solved by this? And so, isn't
Mm.
this really a um, maybe some of them requires you to call Amazon infrastructure and
Oh.
allow a new type of like a new trusted platform provider, or like I'm just thinking of all
Mm.
the things and how the identity flow is really just a subset of these flows.
Yeah, or fundamentally and historically, an IGA flow is a subset of those. I definitely agree with that. But that's, you're at an IGA event, right? So that's what you're going to see. And you're talking to an IDM, an IGA, a leader in the IGA market, and Signal's a small company that's leveraging that market. So obviously those use cases reflect there. I think there's some other exciting things that you could do with this. I mean, I sort of see myself a dynamic world where the types of static human in the loop things that I'll come back to that topic that you see here are become a small subset. I mean, I've often felt that, why can't, when I try and gain access to something and I get an access denied, why don't even show me the access denied, go through a governance flow, see if I could or should have access to that thing, and just give it to me dynamically. And this is almost like a precursor to just in time and through that zero standing privilege. The reason we don't do that, the reason we collect up bags of entitlements and give them to people in advance is because people don't want to wait. But more importantly than that, there's this big gap where you don't know what it means. So you don't get the signal. So here, I mean, gee, I could see a time when share access denied events. They're not just always, we tend to think of them as security events, but no, they could just be like user flow events that could trigger new things. So that again would fit very well with an IGA view of the world where you could dynamically say, yeah, sure, you can have that, Mike. You're the CEO, whatever you say, and provision it and then redirect you. And so one of the exciting things that SailPoint did announce before the event and talked much about at the event was their acquisition of the assets at Savvy, which is a company I was on the advisory board for, which gives you, in effect, a signal generation point in the user experience in the browser. And I'm a big fan for that because, again, you try and do something in your UX and the universal UX of a browser and bam, trigger something. And that's pretty exciting, I think.
Yeah. Well, I'm very aligned with that view of how we need to move into the browser with the Cedarling, which runs as a WASM component.
Yeah.
And but it's a question of how much intelligence should be in that WASM component versus, let's say, the hub
That's it.
system. Um, Although arguably you do want some processing capability there.
Or
Um,
at least presence there. I've always, it's like, yeah, I mean, you're nearly as old as I am. You remember Clippy, the Windows
I,
98 Clippy, that little thing that came up in the browser in the interface. Yeah, you're in the interface. Simple as that.
um, so one of the main things we want to do through this is continuous authentication.
Yeah.
So we get an event and we want to say, okay, this event happened, and therefore I need to maybe expire tokens. Um,
Mhm.
Based on this event, I need to expire or not expire, but actively revoke tokens. Um, and so that I guess could be one of the steps that Cape might take, in addition to triggering an IDM flow. But
Yeah, I think that was a founding use case in lots of ways. I mean, for me, as I'm fundamentally I'm an authorization and governance guy, right? I mean, everything that happens in authentication, I've always sort of been sort of barely distracted by, you might say. So I was just dumbfounded when I realized there was no way of doing a global sign out. I mean, I guess it makes every bit of sense, right? I mean, it isn't a universal connected system, so why would there be? But we often talked a lot about self-sovereign identity and using distributed ledger technology as a way of doing that. Never happened. Um, so yeah, I think it's a generalized revoke signal. And I think when you explain that to people that aren't in the identity space, they go, "Do you mean you don't do that?" I mean, it's a bit like, what? Yeah, I thought that's how it worked, so it's fascinating that's really just having its renaissance and finally being doable.
I say that the two most important authorization policies, the first one is, are you sufficiently authenticated for what you're doing? And the second one is, should I be displaying you content? Like if I'm a browser application and the token has been revoked, why is the dumb application still displaying content? It should know that it shouldn't be displaying content, i.e. logout. So I sort of reverse logout from something we need to actively push and push it into the responsibility of the application to say,
Yeah.
understand whether you're still supposed to be showing the user stuff and interacting with them. So
Yeah, but I think I'm not to blow you smoke, as it were, that horrible phrase here. But but in fairness, Mike, I've learned over the years that you're very attuned to forward-leaning use cases. That your understanding broadly of this entire spectrum is pretty unique, and so yeah, I mean, I'm not if you're seeing it, I think it's a pretty important thing because that's the way it goes, right?
yeah. And I guess along those lines, like I am in the burn it down camp, um, where, of course, SailPoint doesn't want to burn it down because they spent the last 15 years building this great solution. Um, but I'm starting to advocate for moving to a capabilities governance approach versus an
Hmm.
identity governance approach. Because I think fundamentally, when you look at it, and this is where I wonder if if the focus on zero standing privilege and continuous authentication is it incremental improvement in the wrong going to the wrong end, or is it incremental improvement moving to the end we want? Um, and I've really, for the last year or so, I've sort of come to the conclusion that identity is, and this is tough to say being an identirati, but I actually think identity is holding us back. And we need to think about, instead of identity, we need to think about capabilities and governing capabilities. And this existentially goes to what SailPoint is doing because they're governing identity. But what I'm thinking is that that's never going to get you where you need.
Well, I don't know. See, the only challenge I would give you there, and hey, I'm with you there. First of all, look and say burn it down. Look at it and say, should I burn it down? But then when you're doing so, say I got some good wood over there, that'll make this fire go well, in terms of reuse and overlay. And so I'm not a big fan of burn it down. We'll come back to this question about legacy in that. But I've always sort of we jumped onto the identity governance administration thing. But really, I don't think IGA does a lot of identity governance, right? Yes, it creates a meta layer where you aggregate primary sources of identity, to create a universal record around which you can tie accounts, right? Because that's like 101, right? If you don't know where the accounts are. But for me, it's always been about entitlement. And when you say capability, a capability and a capability is the thing that gets wrapped into an entitlement. And for me, the focus of IGA has always been around the entitlement catalog, what it is, what it means to have it, who should have it, the context that you really need to make proper access control decisions.
Right.
I'm interpreting capability correctly there, right?
Um, Actually, I'm going to point you to the homework for this episode, which is being a geek, I have a wiki page for each episode, and I put the homework, I put my takeaways, I put some pictures up. Um, anyway, so this is episode 147. So that's and on the homework, actually, I wrote an article, a Medium article. I write too many of these. Nobody reads them all, I think, except for me. Um, but I wrote one recently
And AI.
about talking.
And AI is reading them too.
Yes. Well,
The
AI is
LLM's reading them.
generating half of them because AI is the research assistant without which none of this would be possible. Um, but I think asking the right questions sometimes is half the challenge. Um, but I recently was thinking about the entitlements catalog, and Ian in his talk said there's gold in that entitlements catalog, and
Oh,
he's
yeah.
really focused on the entitlements catalog too. But I find in my book, capability is simply an action on a resource. So the resource would be like car, and the action, but we need the action because drive car and unlock car have two different risks associated
Yeah,
with them.
yeah.
So, and to me, identity is part of the context.
Yeah, and I think this is a great reason for these types of discussions, because I think we are actually talking about the same thing. And I just think that when you take a governance-based approach to capability, it just goes a little further in terms of the control processes that wrap around it. Because an entitlement catalog would do the same thing. It would say, I've got a thing called a car, I've got called lock car, drive car. They are two base capabilities which are wrapped in an entitlement, and they become an entitlement because one is called, one is must have signed rental agreement, right, before
Yeah.
drive car. So it's a sort of a controls centric and controls proof centric view of capability, and
You
that's
know,
often lost, I think.
actually, I'm really into word derivations. And entitlements and permissions are very interesting in that they're very human oriented. So
Yes.
a permission, an entitlement sort of has an identity orientation. A person is entitled to a capability.
Or a
So
thing, or it could be anything.
yeah, I don't want machine identity. I don't really care whether it's a machine identity or human identity. I don't want
Agreed.
identity to be the organizing principle. I want the capability to be the organizing principle.
Yes. Okay.
And
Yeah.
entitlements is, I think, inherently sort of assumes it's an entitlement of a person. Therefore, I think it has the wrong frame of reference.
Well, I would say again, I guess somebody said to me at the event, a grandfather. They called me grandfather of IGA. I was sure they didn't say godfather because they said grandfather. Just like, okay, fair enough. I'm not a
Pretty
grandfather, by the
soon,
way. I'm
hopefully.
old enough to be, but I'm not.
Yeah,
Um, I think that it's just where you come from, because for me, it's not really about that's the quintessential element of what the entitlement. It's about a control. Again,
right.
everybody comes at this from their own perspective, and we all meet in the middle. From a control, from a repeatable, consistent controls perspective, that's what it comes from. It says whether a person's having or any. This is what it means to have it, how you got it, and my knowledge of you having it, if you like. And so I think we're probably talking about similar things. But I'm with you. I love the idea of being able
Yeah.
to
And you have
retrospectively go
trouble,
bottoms
you
up.
have to throw the you in there. You keep throwing the human in there. It's
Yeah.
very hard to liberate. It took me a year to liberate myself from this thinking around human centricity because we're so tuned, hard coded we're identity. It's all about identity for us. It's very hard. It was very hard for me to get past this. Um, and I think it comes down to governance, because if you look at the core, I was one of the questions I was going to ask you originally was, what does governance mean? Um,
Well, for me, it means, um, like I say, the ability to sort of ontologically I hate using that sort of pseudo academic word, but because it's not just what something is, it's what something isn't as well, and what it's related to, right? But ontologically, understanding something that you care about, be it a data or a permission, understanding under what context it should be available to others, and then also something that we, in all fairness, punted on for the first 10 or 15 years of this due to technical reasons, how it was being used. And so the governance of it includes, like we've always said, who should have access, who does have access, and how that access is being used. Again, we say the word who, but it's what has access, what should have access, what does have access, and what is being used. So for me, it's that full circle. Governance means understanding that, making it provable, meaningful, and usable
Right.
inside the enterprise.
Yeah. So I've come to believe that actually, so that to me, what that says is, so governance to me means that I'm a business and I want to understand my risk. So I need to catalog something and then iterate through every unit of that thing that I'm cataloging and then understand the risk with it associated with it and manage that. And the governing principle for IGA has obviously been people. If I understand who are the people who have which entitlements, I can manage the risk. Um, and I
Yeah,
would argue that
historical.
this is falling apart, and that instead of managing the people, we need to manage the assets. And
Yeah,
now,
I agree. Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. And I think it's just it's like a bottom, it's the same thing spun around, which is, early versions of the IGA tools were and some of the weaker ones, which are still available today, take a very identity down centric business model. And something I found intriguing that I found out, Matt Hamlin and I over at Signal talked about this several times. That in their model, there isn't universally an identity object. It's a bit, and when you come to it from an classic IGA perspective, you're like, what? How does your data model work? But there isn't one because it's a different perspective. So, but I don't think it is identity centric. And what's an agent? But again, when you step back from it, whatever it is, you treat it the same. I did some posting recently that said, agents need to be treated more human than human, and I think that's true for anything that has access. You got to treat it
yeah,
the same
I
way.
just think this is the wrong framing, Darren. And I'll give you another example why. Um, in a lot of transactions, it's not about entitling an action to a single principal. Um, when I'm trying to use my mobile app to call some backend API, there's a lot of software involved here.
Hmm.
So I'm the human, I'm important, but I'm using a piece of mobile software on my phone that's communicating with maybe a content gateway and an API gateway and a lot of downstream like backend services and stuff, an agent that might be making calls on my request. There's a lot of software identity in there. And so the human identity is part of the context, but there's also software identity in there. So in an
Oh,
authorization decision, if I'm looking at an identity down, I would need to have policies separate for software identity and person identity, and it just doesn't work anymore.
no, yes, sure. Let me rephrase that. Maybe I've given you the wrong impression. When I say identity, I really mean identifier, really.
Hmm.
And I don't think it has to be a human at all. And in
Right.
fact, if you cast yourself forward to, a, a 10-year maybe agentic future when there are trillions of agents, I mean, I believe there will be an agent society. And I think there's going to be a set of agent ethics and agent HR departments and almost agent everything. Humans will be irrelevant, but the point is here that identifier will still be relevant and it will have a set of access. And from a governance perspective, we still have to be able to enumerate it,
Every access
understand its risk.
decision has multiple identities that are in the
Yeah.
context. So I
Oh,
can't say, does
absolutely.
this identity have access? I'd have to iterate through them all. There's just no, I don't see any good way to model this by making the person the subject of the
No,
authorization
and
request.
I agree with you on that completely. And I think models that are, I mean, really would be relational models that really sit at the center of that. There are certain products out there today that are locked into that. That would be a technical restriction for them. Because to your point, I think hence the focus on on the resource, which is kind of, the endpoint, the resource, the target, the thing that is being protected. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there, right? I mean, even looking back at the slides we've just seen there, when you interact a real-time contextual decision-making engine with a historical, let's not call it legacy, humanistic approach to IGA, and there's some things you've got to do that don't fit well in the paradigm, right? You've got to recertify policies. You've got to understand attributes relative to identifiers rather than people. And so there's some challenges for
Right.
sure.
And the policy, actually, you're kind of hooking this to policy. Ideally, in governance, you might say, I want to govern the policies, right? That's
Oh,
really
big
what I
time.
want to govern. And Ian had a good point about how multiple silos of policies make this more difficult. Um, but what I saw, or also Ian also said this in his talk, basically we need to reduce the amount of human um, review of policies to reduce the
Human,
number, and so not human in the loop, but access certification campaigns. Is there
oh yeah.
anything more soulless than reviewing the accesses of the people of your reports? I mean, this isn't something people, this is like, it's really, but we're not even that good at it. And so what I see is a movement away from where the ideal goal is to move towards declarative security, where instead of looking at a catalog of entitlements, we want to make statements. We want to say, this is what I think is true. No S3 bucket should be unencrypted. No public S3 bucket should be unencrypted. And we want to prove that those things that we assert, we declare are true, are still true as we move to thousands of policies to govern. The ability of humans who can't think more than 7 things at a time really starts to fall apart. And we need to analyze and reason on our policies. And therefore, the, the question I wanted to ask you is, what are the new kind of tools if we're moving toward this type of enterprise governance infrastructure? What do you think are the next generation of tools that we might need in order to really deliver security to enterprises?
Yeah, layer in this sort of layered um, version 3, we might say, V3
Yeah,
IAM architecture. Well, I've got some very specific answers to that, but let me first take a little bit of a step back and say that I think that the version 3 architecture is one that overlays the existing architecture, right? Legacy doesn't go away, as we found out, right? Not only does it not go away in terms of the resources that we manage, but in the infrastructure that we deploy, right? So
right.
this version 3
I just
architecture, this
pause
can,
there for 1 second. I just want to reiterate that while I'm looking for new solutions, I think basic identity hygiene is still really
oh
important.
yeah,
And we assume that you need that and you need a good joiner leaver. So I'm not saying that any of this isn't,
no.
that it's not important, but it's not enough. So sorry.
Yeah, is necessary but insufficient. I agree with that. So this sort of forward state architecture has the traditional things that we do with static assignment, static entitlement, right? Because those systems aren't going away, even in a big data lake and agent model of the future, right? We're still going to have transactional systems with their own capabilities that are doing things, and they have to be managed largely in a sort of static episodic way, like traditional legacy IGA would do. And I think on the far right-hand side of that, you've got this very dynamic world that is, let's just call it agenic. I hate being that flippant with terms that mean nothing, but agenic over there. And then you've got this sort of transition state in the middle, which is kind of what tools like Signal and other forward-leaning things like Orchid technologies and others are pointing toward, is how do I enhance the old and make ready for the new? And so that's kind of what you asked, what capabilities will be there? Well, for me, number one is policies and attributes. Because if you're going to make an access decision in real time based on a policy that is set around sets of attributes, you sure as hell better understand what the policy is, and you better know the provenance of those attributes.
Yeah.
Otherwise, all bets are off. So what
You're
does that
making the
mean?
case for token-based access control, which is very
Oh,
much about tokens add the provenance into the claims. That's why I think it's worth the
ah, y-
differentiation.
well, maybe it's because I haven't read or looked, but man, I'd make that point a lot more strongly when you talk about TBAC, because that's quintessentially the same thing. Because to answer your question, what has to sort of flow out of this? Because the model very much that Signal and others are drawing now is one that says that we're going to overlay a more dynamic, contextual, data-driven, event-oriented layer on top of what's here and make more contextual decisions. And it's all super exciting. Um, but is the policy right?
You know,
So
let me just make one comment about Signal. They're totally neutral on the policy side. So they don't tell you how to define policies and they don't tell you how to govern policies. So on that, they are totally mum. What they tell you about is how to receive the event and how to invoke an action. But and actually we love their work on transaction tokens, which is sort of like this idea of one token to rule them all for. So it may just make all your APIs only accept transaction tokens, and then you don't have to worry about all those other tokens that we spent so much time issuing. Um, but Signal is very silent on how to express the policies and how to
they
govern
have
those
their own.
policies.
Yeah, and I think this is an area for some leadership direction and vision from, it's not just SailPoint, it's Savient, it's new, other direct competitors, and it's sort of new up and coming folks and the like. But how do you create trust around a policy? How do you create governance lifecycle for a policy? Some of the things are easy, you could just rubber stamp it and call it good, and then do checksums and do all kinds of interesting things to make sure the policy doesn't change. Um, but it's much bigger than that. We do have to answer that question of, because one of the things that IGA did a good job of is saying, hey, business, take responsibility for your action, for what is ultimately your actions, right? In terms of who you give access to and how and when. That still applies here. If you're going to make split-second billion-dollar decisions, you sure as hell, based on the policy, you sure as hell want to know what that policy means, right? So, gee, we haven't answered that. So let's look for some vision there. And then I think the other thing is based, sort of related to the whole graph thing, and on the data provenance. Make decisions based on age. Well, where did that age attribute come from? Where is it verified, and by whom, and under what
Mm.
circumstances? And I see very little policy that says, it just says age 18. It doesn't say age when provenance of that attribute comes from Mike directly through a secure channel. There's very little of that goes on today, and I think we'll have to do more of it.
Um, Perhaps my pessimism about humans is going to shine through here, but I think formal reasoning maybe will take the place wherever possible around governance, or will become whatever we can reason over. We don't need to govern manually. So I see next generation tools moving towards formal reasoning and declarative security, and moving towards manual review processes like, let's say, old time IGA as a fallback
Yeah,
for all your one-off
for the legacy.
applications. But that's sort of my take on where this is going. That we have to get the humans out of the way, and that humans need to review those assertions. But when it comes to actually evaluating the policies, if there are going to be thousands of policies, humans can't actually like square whether one of the policy 403 conflicts with policy 302 and overrides it. That this has gone beyond the realm of human comprehension, and we need a next generation of tools based on math and less based on humans.
Let's just say that I live now on the other side of this whole paradigm, right? Folks pull me into decisions around funding companies, and let's just say yes, that formal proof logic applied to policies that do things like that is a great place to invest, is a great place to look at for the future. I think, because I agree, it's got to happen in real time. But also things like, we still have to so I could sort of see a time of a periodic sort of, we've got this agent, we've got a specialized agent that's actually making these policy um, uh, providence question, answering them for us. Let's just assume that happens. Every now and then, someone's still going to pop up and say, "Hey, Darren, go prove it." And so,
Hmm.
what is missing, and what no one seems to make much of, is I want to be able to do sort of what if, and given this set of attributes, or given this dynamic grouping of people, or given this scenario, who would have access? Would you have said yes or no? Who or what would get access? There's sort of I see a lot more of that type of access review, almost like a dynamic proof, more than
Yeah.
a static access review.
Yeah. So the question isn't, do you have access at this moment, given this context, but who has
Would you?
access given this context?
Could
Um,
you have access?
and
Right.
yeah, and these are sort of open, challenges in sort of, I guess, the authorization space.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Which
I
is why
think
we
that we're
love it.
moving to, my take on this is that the next generation of these CI/CD tools, or of these, I'm sorry, I already told you the punchline. The next generation of these governance tools looks more like CI/CD. And I posted an article, which I think a lot of people probably didn't see. LinkedIn probably didn't show it to them, about Signal introduced a new crypto protocol, Signal, the messaging app. They're sort of on the cutting edge of crypto. And at the end of that article, they talk about the role of formal reasoning in their CI/CD process. And I wonder if the next generation of tools looks more like CI/CD tools that check. We see the infrastructure, cloud native infrastructure, moving to declarative configuration. I wonder if our security infrastructure will also become declarative and will also move more into a CI/CD type of process. And that's an area that SailPoint hasn't really played in. What do you think that could happen, or what would the existing vendors like? How are they going to be able to make this pivot?
Yeah, well, the thing, the sort of dichotomy of this space is that everything around formal logic and some of the things you're talking about here are all great. They're research projects, they're science projects, they are the future. I personally believe there's a lot to be made there. But today, still, people are still trying to do some really basic things. And so it's really difficult commercially to have your foot in both camps, which is why, I mean, Signal has an amazing future-leaning place in the architecture, but today it's being used to overlay dynamic type privileged access verification. It's solving a 10-year-old problem around PAM, right? That we did with the vault. So there's this sort of dichotomy between these two things. That what you're doing, there's not a lot of money to be made out of a CI/CD oriented formal logic that could overlay preventative security. People are still trying to skin the 10-year-old cat around PAM, for example. Um, so what does it mean for the vendors? This is it. We go where the dollars go, right? That's who the
Yeah.
investor doesn't want to invest in something that doesn't have a 5-year exit window. It's kind of the unfortunate truth.
I realized that we were talking about Signal, the company in our industry, and then I brought up Signal, the messaging app,
Yeah,
and
that's good. Yeah, I find
utterly
something.
confusing that is.
Yeah,
Um,
I, I
so
think what's the gentleman's name? It was not Mossy, the author of Signal that was over at WhatsApp.
I don't know actually,
M-
but
m- m- m-
I use the app.
Me too. His name begins with M. My apologies. He's not going to be watching, but if he is, my apologies. But yeah, what a genius! I mean, man, fantastic. I'm a big Signal fan. I
Yeah,
Signal the tool, the messaging tool,
the messaging
um,
app, just to be
the
clear. Yeah.
messaging app, Signal. Um, but yeah, to answer your point, what do the vendors have to say about it? I think it's just, man, am I glad I'm not a vendor anymore. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You're invariably driven by sets of metrics that are unobtainable, and so I love being on the other side of it. It's much more fun because we can have conversations like this, and the time I'm spent now going away and thinking about formal proof, thinking about that, aren't taking away from something pedestrian and money oriented.
Yeah. AI has increased the rate of innovation in our product space by a lot. It's faster to spec out and grok products now. And so
Yeah.
it's gotten even more challenging. With that, I'll just last thoughts before we break.
Well, we didn't talk a lot about this dynamic use case heading towards the world of agents and agent access, agent models. And one of the things I would love to come back on the show sometime and talk about is how we start putting some concrete models together around agent identifiers. This idea that an agent has an identification, it has a run as user, it has a set of proxy access. There's sets of things there that I think we should get our hands around right away, very quickly, because they are going to be dynamic and they are going to require orchestration. So, there's some basic referencing things that we have to solve, which are very doable, which we could do now. So, great space as usual. Hence why you don't get away.
I was just chatting on LinkedIn with Sarah Caccetti and about doing an AI episode. She's now at Beyond Identity. So maybe you want to join. And that's a topic we do every month because everybody has an opinion about AI and agentic identity. And it's really embryonic and it's really evolving fast right now. And bringing a lot of attention to problems that we probably should have solved years ago, but never had the motivation to solve. So,
well,
yeah, maybe we could have you back with Sarah.
I'd love to, because I'm also fascinated by, is and can AI be conscious? I'm way out there in neuroscience and science of consciousness and phenomenal consciousness and all that jazz. So we can go.
Have you watched Murderbot?
Sorry?
Have you watched the Apple TV show Murderbot?
No, is it good?
It's awesome. You really should. I read the books too. The books are also good. But it's a very, we don't have enough metaphors in our society sometimes for these new things we need to talk about. And Murderbot has a number of metaphors. He has this thing called the governor module. That's like a PDP in his head that he walks around with. He talks to Hub System, which monitors whether his decisions he's making and sends him software updates. And then there's a threat analysis. So it's a science fiction show where they personified the components of cybersecurity into characters.
Oh,
so
nice.
he talks about the governor module and the threat assessment module like it's a person, or Hub System like it's a person. So there's a lot of interesting metaphors in there.
Yeah.
The problem is it's so obscure that nobody knows those metaphors. So it's not like the Death Star, everyone knows. So that's the one challenge with this metaphor. But I think you'll definitely, it's entertaining TV. So
great.
Your spouse will like it too.
Love it. A good reference for something to watch and some interesting conversation. So yeah, awesome. Okay. Thanks for that.
And next episode, you mentioned, Darren, you mentioned data lakes, and here we go. Yes, we need an identity data lake. That's our next topic for next week. With that, I'll say, Darren, really thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you on, and thank you, audience, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.